Yeah. Okay, so I'll do the question and hand you the mic and we'll go from there. Okay, Doctor?
Great.
Sounds good. Was the 2008 financial crisis a catalyst for the nationalistic trend we now see across the Europe and the U.S., or were there other factors? Where do you think this nationalistic trend is coming from?
Thank you. That's a really great question. I think it's a huge part of it. A huge part of it. If you look at the financial crisis in 2008, the first 6 months were worse than the financial crisis in 1929-30. Right? So if you track, and two economists have done this, Barry Green and Kevin O'Rourke, they looked at the drop in GDP, the drop in the stock market, the rise in unemployment. For the first 6 months, it's significantly worse than the Great Depression. And then it eases off a bit and it levels out. So whereas the Great Depression continued, this one doesn't. And the reason people believe is largely because of how countries reacted, both the decisions they made domestically, so they didn't go largely for austerity initially and didn't let banks fail, and also because they cooperated internationally. But the crisis was still very severe, and it was by far the worst since the 1930s. So if you look at what happened in the 30s, we got the rise of fascism, the rise of communism in many places, World War II. Luckily, we've avoided those things. But that doesn't mean to say that there's no consequence, right? And so I think what we have seen is a deterioration in people have less faith in the international economy, in the domestic economy, and in international politics, and in domestic politics, right? They're moving away from it because they believe leaders have failed them, and they don't buy into the idea that actually the response was effective, right? Because no leader worth their salt can say, yeah, I know you're hurting economically, but it's better than it was in the 30s, right? They'd be laughed out of town if they said that. But the fact is, and they would be, voters would be right to laugh them out of town, but the fact is that this was a once in every 50-year event that was so severe that it just swamped everything else. It was almost impossible to deal with. And it normally, after recessions caused by financial crises, it usually takes 11 or 12 years for there to be a recovery. And so where we are now, we're at about the 10-year mark. So it's not I think it's not a surprise to me that there's been this populist reaction, because I think people are genuinely and legitimately frustrated, and they don't see sort of the improvements. And I think it's worse actually in Europe than it is here, because in Europe, many people feel that the controls are in the hands of the EU, so it's not even their national governments. And they don't know who to vote for to get change, because if they vote for a populist party, they can be constrained by the European level of sort of governance, and they don't really understand why businesses and others are bailed out. So I think that this will basically continue until there's robust economic growth that sort of and wage growth, and that revives people's sort of confidence over time. But I think what we've seen is really, there are other issues as well, but I think the financial crisis piece of it historically is such an important part of it that we would not be seeing what we're seeing today if it wasn't for, around the world, if it wasn't for the financial crisis.
Thank you very much. Okay. So somewhat narrow question, but interesting. One of our attendees says he continues to read that the U.S. State Department is dangerously understaffed. And when he mentions this to his friends, they say, so what? What are some of the worst case scenarios that may result from an understaffed State Department? And has this situation happened previously?
Yeah, it's a great question, and people will often say, well, why do we need the State Department anyway? Like, we have a Secretary of State, why do we need all these other people? But let me give you a couple of examples. There's no Assistant Secretary now for East Asia. There's no Ambassador to Seoul, and there's no State Department envoy for North Korea, right? So if you think about the way the US government is organized, there's the President, VP, there's a national security advisor, and then he is a staff, and on that staff there's one person who's sort of responsible for Asia, and they have a little team, and then the State Department, has an Asia bureau, and then they have these Asia experts, and they have the ambassador, and then there's some people in the Pentagon. President Trump is trying to prepare a summit with Kim Jong-un, which is probably the most risky summit any American president has embarked on since Kennedy met Khrushchev in 1961, right? I mean, which went really badly. But it's a very dramatic summit with really no preparation, right? It's happening very suddenly. And the worry in this, I'm just trying to put a specific example on it, and I can get to the general numbers in a second, but the worry is that there's nobody really in the US government who's an expert on Korea and on North Korea, outside of the intelligence community, who's a part of the policy process, who can say, this is what they really mean, or here's how we prepare. And those positions that are vacant, those will be the positions that will provide that expertise. Right, so to make it even more specific, the North Korean leader has said that he is willing to talk about denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And President Trump has said, this is a great sign, he's conceded, he's going to talk about getting rid of his nukes. But the language he has used is identical to the language all he and his father have used for years. There's no difference in the language, right? And so one worry is that it's hard for them to sort of interpret, some of these things. Now, that's been pointed out by outsiders since. I think the message has sort of gotten through a bit, at least to the White House people. But you really need that indigenous internal expertise, particularly for classified information that we don't know on the outside. So I'm quite worried about that. Then, if you look at the Middle East, which in the State Department is called the Bureau for Near East Affairs, there's no assistant secretary for that, right? So that would normally be a very high-level person who would be responsible for running Middle East policy. Well, that person doesn't exist. Right? They're not in place. There was an acting person for a while, but even acting can last beyond a certain period of time. So there's a vacancy there. And there are several other vacancies that are crucially important too. So these aren't really positions that are, just abstract, academic or bureaucratic positions. These are actually vital positions that it's almost unimaginable that you would do something like have a summit with North Korea or be engaged in a diplomatic initiative in the Middle East without having that expertise in place. Then there is a final problem too, and I think this is a particular problem that if Mike Pompeo is confirmed as Secretary of State and that John Bolton will have, is that they really have a problem on staffing, because a lot of people signed one of those letters criticizing President Trump. And all of those people, most of the Republican foreign policy establishment signed one of those letters. There's over 100 people, high-level people, and they are all banned from serving in the administration. So you have a bench of about 100 of the best and people on the Republican side, many of whom are I know are really, really good at what they do. Maybe we don't always agree they're excellent. Well, they're not allowed to go in, and so that's another problem. And so the worry is really that you're, from the point of view of the administration, they're embarking upon these incredibly risky, ambitious endeavors. Unilaterally withdrawing from Syria, possibly a trade war, pulling out of the Iran deal, and a summit with Kim Jong-un, without the A or even B team in place. And so I think that's sort of the worry. And so that, I don't know if your friend would, whoever asked that question, I don't know if they would sort of, they would accept that, but I think it does have a real consequence. It's not just, jobs for the boys and girls and just filling up positions. Like, these are actually very important positions, and the reason they're filled. I would say one final thing that has been reported about President Trump is he worked his role was as the head of a business that did a large amount of business overall in money terms, but was very small or in organizational terms. So it's a small family business in that sense, in terms of the management structure. And there have been reports that he finds it hard to get his head around the fact that the US government is so large, and actually parts of it that he doesn't see are vitally important, right? So he thinks, I have a Secretary of State, that person will take care of diplomacy. And when he was asked about the positions, like, we don't need all those positions, why would we need them? And I think there is a bit of a disconnect there. And hopefully, I'm actually hopeful that Mike Pompeo will be able to communicate that to him, because Pompeo has said the right things in the hearing on rebuilding the State Department, and he has a close relationship with President Trump. So, I think maybe that's one area where he might be well advised to try to make that case, that he needs to fill these positions, and he needs some relaxation of that ban in order to be able to get the right people.
Let me interject for a quick question on my own part, building on something you just said. We hear reports that Pompeo and Bolton are not the best of friends. Can you get a comment?
I may have mentioned that yesterday. Yeah, a lot of people think they are going to be, unified, but I actually think they may not be. They're very different. Pompeo is a politician, highly skilled, who's risen quite quickly, who's still fairly young. He's 54. I think he has future ambitions politically. And he's played the hardliner when he's needed to, but he's also well respected by European diplomats and others who've worked with him who don't agree with him. Bolton is probably in his last job in government, is quite ideological in terms of what he wants, is a little bit more narrowly focused in terms of how he looks at the world, and is also sort of a bureaucratic fighter who distrusts the State Department in particular and has written widely about that. So I think that actually Pompeo will worry about Bolton as a rival in terms of the State Department stuff, so he'll see him as basically a threat to the influence of the State Department. And I also think he has a consequential decision to make about whether or not he aligns with Secretary Mattis on issues or with John Bolton. And I wouldn't rule out him aligning with Mattis, actually. I don't know, but I think that from his point of view, he can't really afford this to end in a crisis. All of these issues, and on something like Iran, where he's been pretty hard line, we still have learned very little about what their plan is for the day after they pull out of the Iran deal. And that's what I would worry about if I was him. That's what I worry about anyway, is what are they going to do? And Mattis, I think, has some understanding of that. And so I think that we may see more of a relationship there than people think at the moment.
Okay, thank you. You talked about the Russian-Chinese approach to the world order versus the liberal democratic order. If the U.S. moves towards the Russian-Chinese model, what's the likelihood of the U.S. moving towards the Russian-Chinese model? And then B, if we do, who's going to lead the other side of the coin? Is it Germany?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the U.S. is basically indispensable as the leader. I don't think there's anyone else who can come in. There were others who can fill the gap for a while, right? I mean, they can sort of work to try to keep things afloat for a little bit at a time, but not in the long term. And definitely, I think a lot of people have hopes for Germany in that, but I don't think they'll be able to do it because culturally and strategically, they're just not even close to playing that role. I mean, the Chancellor Merkel has said good things about the international order and all of that, but for very understandable reasons, they obviously aren't interested in playing the role that the US does militarily, and they don't think about the entire world strategically because they are sort of located in Europe, so they don't have that interest in Asia or the rest of the world. So I think we won't really see it from them. The countries that have been trying the most, I think, are France and Japan. And you know, Abe and Macron have both sort of stylized themselves as a you know, as trying to bolster the US in this endeavour. But in France's case, much as I sort of admire what he's trying to do, they still have very little capacity. You know, they still are much smaller than the US is. And in Japan's case, their hands are full in terms of regional issues. And both of them are even worried about where President Trump is headed at the moment on North Korea and on Iran, so respectively. So I think that we won't really see that change. I think that in terms of where the US is headed, I think if the US did basically endorse that Chinese-Russian vision, I think it would really spell a lot of trouble for the existing order. I don't think it could survive. I think we really won't know the answer to that question until 2021. Because I think basically what's happening now is, you know, President Trump won, he didn't expect to win, so he wasn't really prepared to implement his views on things. It was a surprise to him as much as it was to everybody else. And the rest of the world was shocked by it, but they really have no plan B, and they really need the old system to continue to work. So they are basically playing for time, and they're trying to be very supportive and engage with the administration in the hope that, you know, the US sort of turns back a little bit. And within the US government, you see a lot of people trying to keep things going, you know, and you see the cabinet and everything trying to have a lot of continuity, even though President Trump talks about fundamental change. Well, if he's re-elected, I think, and on a platform of America First that's uncompromising, then I think all that's over. Then I think the rest of the world believes this is basically a fundamental change, right? This is not a temporary anomaly, this is a permanent shift. And even if they have no plan, they have to find one, even if it's worse, right? So they just have to figure it out. And it will be something, it will be very different. And then in the US, I think that the mainstream folks who want to sort of keep it going will largely give up, because they'll think, you know, well, he's won twice, and there'll be enough people with experience in the first term that they can enable that. And so I think basically we're in a bit of a waiting period where different things have been tried, there's contradictory approaches, we don't really know where it's going, you know, there's things on both sides you can sort of see, but it you know, could easily turn back, but if it doesn't, then I think it's headed in that direction.
Thank you. This question is going to build off your 2021 comment. While this organization, the World Affairs Council, is nonpartisan, some of our questioners are not. Given Trump's temperament, inexperience, and fly-off-the-handle modus operandi, do you think we'll still all be standing here by Inauguration Day 2021?
Good question.
It's definitely from a Trump supporter, right? So look, I think that one of the remarkable things about the last year and a half has been how resilient the system has sort of been. You know, I think that if you propose this scenario 3 years ago, we'd probably have, after a year and a half, had, you know, many people might have more apocalyptic, you know, views of what would have occurred in the intervening period. And so, in some ways, you know, I think Trump has been a radical departure in many ways, but in other ways he is not. On the foreign policy side, national security side, which is the one I'm most concerned about, you know, I've been a pretty strong critic of his, and I would definitely stand by that, but I think it's also true that there are elements within the administration that have managed to constrain him to some degree. What I would say is, I think that if something really badly goes wrong, I actually think it's going to be in the next 4 or 5 months. I don't think it will be next year. And I didn't anticipate it being last year. Last year I thought it would be this year. The reason I thought that was because I thought he didn't like being managed. and he wanted to try to break out. And if he wanted to break out, he would have to change his people and get a new team in place, which he's just done. And there would be a moment where he would try different things, trust his gut, do big things, and that those things could go really badly. And if he didn't really break out now, then he wouldn't do so next year, because he would have tried and it wouldn't have worked. So if the Iran deal is still in place in a year, I don't think he pulls out in a year. I think he either pulls out in May, or maybe in October, November, if he gives it one more 6 months. But it's likely to be this year. And if there's a major problem in Korea, and there are two major risks in Korea, I think one is the summit's a total failure and he moves very quickly to conflict, and the other is the summit's a tremendous success, they get on really well, and they do a really bad deal that is not in America's long-term interest, it's highly controversial. The good outcome is probably a slow process where they kick it back to their teams to negotiate a complicated deal over a period of time, and then they come back and meet again in a year to confirm it. That probably will be a good outcome, maybe depending what's in it, but that could be a good outcome. But if there's a bad outcome, that's going to happen soon as well. And then on the trade side, if we see a full-blown trade war of return to 30s protectionism, that's probably going to happen this year too, right? Because he's just put in place, he's just gotten rid of Gary Cohn, he's brought in, Lighthizer, Navarro, and others, giving them more senior positions. And the so-called free trader like Larry Kudlow is not really that experienced in terms of government. So no one, really thinks he might be able to push back that hard, even though he's a free trader. So something goes wrong there, it will happen pretty soon. So I sort of see this period as like the defining moment, on those national security issues. And I'm not saying that we need to try to to level a criticism at him, but I think substantively, when you look at the new team, you look at their disposition, and then you look at these three major issues, and you can maybe add Syria, possible withdrawal from Syria into the mix too, that they're all coming to a boil around the same time. And that's sort of what worries me. So what I say to you maybe is, if we're standing here in a year, we'll be standing here in 3 years.
That's a well choice. I first heard you speak on your research into Trump's foreign policy back in 2016 at Brookings when I was down in the National Conference. You topped yourself today. Fantastic presentation, fantastic Q&A, right? On behalf of the World Affairs Council, I'd like to give you a token of our esteem and appreciation for coming today. And once again, fantastic presentation. And everyone buy the book. I got it. It's great. Thank you.